Welcome to the Ideal Spaces Working Group podcast.
Spaces podcast hosted by Ulrich Gehmann and Grant Rainham from Ideal Spaces Foundation with Anna de Jong. Can you please say some words about you and your activities, Anna?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Anna de Jong, as Ulrich said. I'm a professor in tourism and regional development currently at the University of Glasgow, and I have a background in geography, human geography, but my research is interested in the development of tourism, particularly in peripheral or rural areas where there's often a construction of tourism as an essential dimension of the economy in these places. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in how that idea of tourism gets constructed through tourism governance processes and the consequences of that for placemaking, place change, and the residents that live in those places.
Mm-hmm. As regards place making and place changing, the changing aspect in relation to the making of places, which are the major factors according to your research and your experience?
Oh, yeah, that's a really big question, and obviously it varies so much between the places. So the current project that I work on is the Just Tour project, and through that project we're looking at 3 different places, one of which is Tenerife in the Canary Islands, which most people are familiar with, very heavily touristified place. Another is Scotland, which is an island in the Baltic Sea, that's part of Sweden. And the third is the area of Lochaber, which is in the Scottish Highlands. And place change looks so different. And, what that looks like in terms of materiality looks so different in those 3 places. In Tenerife, of course, it has shown itself, particularly in the south of the island, through quite significant development of resort infrastructure along that southern coast. So a lot of it is kind of large-scale hotels and the support infrastructure that would go around that, such as swimming pools, water event spaces and things like that. But in the other 2 sites, it has maybe integrated or intersects a bit more with the place. They're both more geared towards kind of more nature-based and outside spaces, particularly Lochaber, which is a kind of known as the UK's adventure capital because it's got its largest mountain. And then in Gotland, it has a similar kind of landscape in the sense of Lochaber, but then Visby, the main administrative centre on Gotland, is also a UNESCO designated site because it's seen to have one of the best retained medieval cities in Sweden, and it's also seen to be a living city, so people still live within or are thought to live within that kind of the medieval area of the city. So that has become interesting in the way that that's intersected with tourism as well, in the sense that on one level the heritage of Visby must be retained to continue with that UNESCO designated status, but at the same time how that's been retained and the material elements of that have been kind of questioned to be more geared towards tourists, in the sense of the way that the street signs are presented and the materials that are used for the road and the colours of the houses and things like that. It very much appeals to an international visitor rather than being something that might have been there in the original medieval city or something that facilitates residents' ability to continue living there?
Mhm. From your perspective, so when we take these three cases you mentioned, when we take these cases together, which are the major devastating effects of tourism and tourist industry in regards to places, to original places, and in regards to the inhabitants of these places?
Mm. Yeah, to take the second aspect to that question first, in we being a geographer, we look at, as I mentioned, we look at these places on kind of more of a region level, but the way that tourism shows itself is actually through creating quite distinct influence in very small geographical areas at, say, the size of a town or a village, taking Visby, or even, say, taking the example of Glenfinnan in the Lochaber region, which is where that one a crucial Harry Potter film site, where the viaduct is, the famous kind of Harry Potter bridge. Mm-hmm. And what occurs then within those kind of very specific geographical areas is a quite strong transformation of that place that actually creates for some people within those areas a feeling that they can no longer remain living there for a number of reasons. On one level, often housing is tied very often to these touristification processes where the area becomes gentrified. Residents can no longer afford the rent or to be able to purchase a home in those places, so they don't have kind of physical access to the place. But also the landscape can change so much in these smaller geographical areas within regions because they are geared towards tourists. So this is something that residents living in the inner city of Visby speak about a lot, in the sense that not that long ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there was a butcher, there was a bakery, there were more schools in the inner city, there were dentists and doctors. Now the rents have increased so much in those areas, and the main market in those areas are the visitors, the tourists. So it becomes kind of unfeasible for those kind of key services, the elements of a place that come together to really make a sense of place, and are no longer there, and the infrastructure and the commercial spaces are geared towards the visitor rather than the resident. So they look around and they lose a sense of place. So through that there's a displacement. There's also, I think, in tourist areas often kind of more of a seasonal displacement process, particularly in areas where seasonality is quite significant, where you get in Visby, for example, and to a certain extent in kind of Fort William and Lochaber, a real heavily geared, a place that's heavily geared in the summer to visitors, and it's crowded, it's loud, it's challenging to move around and live your life, to get to school, to get to work, to pick up children, to take them to their various activities in the summer. But then everything closes and it almost becomes a ghost town in the winter months when people are no longer there. So there's a feeling of more like alienation in these places, and the shops close, and a lot of the houses remain empty. So in that sense, it becomes an unknown place. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, when you look at cities like this, because we've had conversations with people from bigger cities like Rome, Milan, so forth, where touristification and things like this are causing major problems, even in big centers. In these small centers you're talking about, like in Gotland, there's artifacts, there's sort of cultural pieces. Are they being affected, or are they being slowly destructed by the amount of people that are there? And a second part would be for me to know whether there's a short-term or a long-term solution to the influx of tourists over short periods of time.
I think in the places that we've been looking at, it's a lot of the concern comes from the environmental degradation of these places, particularly thinking of, well, all three really, Lochaber, Gotland, and actually very much Tenerife as well. There's really strong concerns around the environmental outcomes of touristification processes. And for example, one of the main controversial development sites in Tenerife at the moment is in El Portito, which is along the southern coastal strip of Tenerife. And it's seen to be one of the kind of last coastal fishing villages along that southern strip, because so much of the area has been developed for tourism. Mm. And in that place, there's really significant environmental heritage. Some of the threatened endemic species on the island have been found in this site, and then they've already been taken away in other areas. And there's also a really strong, there's also been evidence of I'm going to mispronounce the name, but the Gaunches are the indigenous first people of Tenerife, and there's evidence that they had settlements in this area, which is now being destroyed. So there's a really significant concern, and a lot of the protests that we've seen that are coming out of Tenerife through the 20A movement are in response to these quite a high-end luxury developments that are taking place along this southern coastal strip. That is already seen to be so vulnerable, and there isn't necessarily a strong justification for continued development there, given there is already a lot of infrastructure geared towards tourism. So yeah, I think there's a real sense of loss and care for these places as in response to tourism. What can be done to answer the kind of second part of the second dimension of the question there? I think there are a lot of things that can be done, and I think often, for example, the work that we do, and say we work and speak with a lot of activist groups or resident organizations that are seeking to introduce or influence decision making around tourism in these locations, and they're very rarely anti-tourism. They really understand that tourism has a role in the economy, and there are benefits that come from it. It's more that the neoliberal kind of growth model that influences the tourism governance structure in these places it's been set up in a way where the public local government structures don't actually have a lot of capacity or influence in what gets done, because of the requirements. If they were going to carry out their regional development objectives with the reduced funding that they actually have, they become very heavily dependent on private industry in order to carry out their activities. So then it becomes a situation where you have kind of a privatized or unauthorized actors influencing how these places change and influencing the development that actually gets done. But there could be which in a sense that's a really kind of powerful thing, and that's very difficult to change on one level. But if more participatory forms of governance and kind of more representative democratic processes were put into place, then different forms of tourism could start to evolve that thinks about the connection between residents and how these are first and foremost places that have significant heritage and places that communities want to remain in and contribute to.
What is the role of the reaction of this, let's call it what you said, privatized influences? Do the guys, these privateers, do the guys react on these proposals, or do they just don't care?
Yeah, I think that varies again. I suppose on one level I should say, like throughout project, it's actually very tricky to speak with the developers, the private investors. That's been the group that we've had the most challenge reaching out to, and there's obviously like no surprises with that. They're international conglomerates that are deliberately designed often to be quite tricky to reach. And but on another level, when we speak to key decision makers, I think there is a genuine recognition of the challenges. It's more about having the tools and capacities to actually respond, given the pressures that they are under to attract investment to places in order to be perceived to continue to grow and develop.
Mm-hmm. And the role of the government in this entire process, can the government actually influence something, let's say, in the right direction? For instance, together with activist groups or other stakeholders being interested in the positive conservation of a place and a landscape?
I think they definitely, with the government actors that we've spoken to, particularly in Gotland and Le Cava, are really keen to do exactly that and are genuinely trying to find ways to do it. For example, in Gotland at the moment, they're attempting to restructure their tourism governance process, because as it is at the moment, they only have one Region Gotland government employee whose remit is specifically focused on tourism decision making and strategy. So they are trying to transition this and attract kind of more government funding towards the development of tourism and management of tourism, and thinking it and positioning it more as a within the regional development strategy that they have. So they're trying to make a case for more employees for this, and trying to use this as a way to connect tourism and the private actors to other elements of their kind of service processes that they deliver beyond tourism itself. So tourism isn't just a separate thing, but it becomes a catalyst for regional development more. Obviously, that requires more economic capacity within the government, within the official kind of state, the Region Gotland, in order to achieve that. So that's going to take some time. But the idea is to reduce the power and the influence that the private actors actually have on decision making. And as part of that, they are also trying to bring in, so in Gotland, you have these community-run development companies that have evolved and sprung up over Gotland over the last kind of since the 2000s, early 2000s, and they are essentially kind of run community development organisations that are run by the community, and some of the work that they do is involved with tourism as well. So running kind of buying the schoolhouse, for example, and running cafes, accommodation, museums, things like that within the communities across the island. So they're trying to bring in these community organisations more into this new governance structure as well, to kind of spread the influence and spread the representation a bit more broadly. They when we speak with them, they do also really wish to think about what other mechanisms, like community participatory structures, could we bring into that process. But to do that in a way that doesn't, because they always have this kind of pressure to continue development, to continue bringing in economic value to the area. That really is their kind of goal. And bringing in more representative, I think there is a hesitancy to bring in more representative voices in the sense that they create complex things that slow down decision-making processes. So it's about which that's from their perspective. That's not necessarily something that I agree with, but it's how to, from their position, how to bring in more representative voice in a way that doesn't kind of stop basically what they want to do. So there's a tension there, I think, which is important, but I think there is definitely a willingness to try to do it.
Mhm. As regards the economic value as a prime aim, are there considerations to have different models of how to generate more economic value, for instance, also in terms of quality and not only in terms of monetary quantity?
Yes, definitely. Yes, I think that's definitely something that they consider, and also like they're in Gotland, for example, they're introducing it has historically always been a place that people return to, and do really feel a strong connection to the island, and I think is a priority. It changed a bit around 2018 when they got a cruise terminal, but I think there is a shift and a value in having people that are coming to the island that know the place and connect with the place, and spend quite long periods on the island. This has shown itself. That's definitely a narrative that comes through in Loch Harbour in Scotland as well, and also something that's happening in Tenerife, but perhaps it's been a little bit more controversial in Tenerife, or hasn't quite worked the way that they thought it would, because interestingly, so the southern, where most people visit along the southern coastal strip, it is obviously a very certain type of tourism that is seen as quite a cost-effective relatively for people to travel to, and most people would stay in their resort and wouldn't spend money in the local economy, for example. So they did have a shift post-COVID towards a sustainability strategy that focused on kind of more high-end luxury forms of tourism, and trying to attract more of a middle class, what they refer to like as a curious traveller, someone that was going to engage with other areas of the island and be more connected to the cultural heritage and the environmental landscape of the place, which on some level that's been really positive in kind of dispersing tourism across the island. But because at the same time they're still very focused on high numbers, they haven't gotten rid of that kind of prioritization. What's resulted is actually quite a significant increase in the numbers visiting Tenerife, around 7 million a year to an island that's only around 2,000 kilometers squared, and more. And it's put a lot more pressure on the whole island. So a lot of people, middle class people, hiring cars to travel to the different areas around the island. So it's I suppose it's been done in a way where they weren't willing to remove from the quantity aspect and introduce the quality aspect in addition. So it's been quite interesting and a little and concerning as well to see what's resulted from that strategy.
Mm-hmm.
In these smaller places in Gotland, Visby, right? I guess is the city, right?
Yeah.
Is there still a sense of identity there? Is there sort of a collective consciousness of the local community, or is the tourism also taking away from that sort of community feeling of the people that are there?
I think it's a really interesting question. I would say from the research that we've done, that there's a very strong Gotlandic identity that's quite distinct. I think being an island helps with that, because they do see themselves as separate to the Swedish mainland. But I suppose it's the way that it's shown itself is there are less people living in the inner city, so the inner walls of the medieval city. So perhaps maybe less of a Visby Visby identity, even though the broader Gotlandic identity is really strong. And I think it plays out in interesting ways in Gotland, because they're also, I think that's why the residents there are so impassioned, because they do have such a strong connection to place. And you see, and they also have a very strong culture of disagreement and discussion, open discussion, which plays out in the local media. So a lot of residents will write into Hela Gotland, which is the local magazine on Gotland, and voice their concerns, and have quite long editorial pieces there that really get picked up and read and engaged with. And then key decision makers will come back and engage with those pieces. So there's a really interesting dialogue playing out there around what Gotland is and what it means and what we want it to be, which I think is having an indirect influence on, if not a direct kind of formal, if not being part of the direct formal process of decision making. And I think that really comes from a really strong sense of care for the place and wanting it to be managed in a way that is for the benefits of the place and the people there.
I mean, with Tenerife, for instance, you have the Spanish culture, of course, there, but I know, for instance, that there's a lot of German tourism, for instance, that goes into Tenerife and the islands in the Mediterranean and just off the coast. So that there's sort of also a cultural thing of, like Germans, for instance, going to places and resorts where there's other Germans, because they sort of have a common sort of consciousness about their language and what's going on. In these smaller places, is it the same thing? Is it Swedish to Swedish, or is it a lot of international tourism?
In Lochaber and in Gotland, yeah, it's so interesting to see the migrant communities in Tenerife, and that's there. I've been doing interviews with people, and it's really interesting to see the communities and the culture that they create in Tenerife. And I would say there's a distinct Canarian identity that people talk about as well. But in the other places, that's an interesting question. It's definitely, I mean, these are Lochaber and Gotland are in the north, north and west of Europe. So they don't attract kind of long-term migrants in the same way that Tenerife does. So they don't have, in the same way, these communities. I would say it's probably a bit more integrated. There is definitely more of a narrative of kind of internal domestic migration to that plays out through a construction of the romanticization of nature and the countryside in both Lochaber and Gotland, that people say a lot of Lochaber receives a lot of English retirees that move to the area and can afford to pay quite high prices for the real estate there, and seek to perhaps live out a certain type of retirement there, which is interesting. And I think the same in Gotland to a certain extent. Particularly, a lot of people will have second homes in Visby and in Gotland, and perhaps choose to retire there eventually as well. So it's more a domestic migration.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw that with the English also, like in the south of France and also the south of Spain. There was second houses bought, a lot of locations were done, but a lot of the year, a lot of these homes and houses aren't used, They're sort of like second houses, and people go for 2 months and then they go back to England or they go back to wherever. So I think there's also a non-usage of the properties that exist,
100%, yeah. And it's interesting with some of every community in Lochaber is so different, but in a couple of the communities with the people that we have been speaking with, there's an interesting management of that in a way where rather than residents being caught up in this idea that they could get quite a lot of money if they were to sell their house, because there's such a strong attraction for kind of people moving to the area. What they might actually do is keep their house off the open market and sell it through personal networks in order to influence and control who's actually moving into the village, because they really want to attract people who are maybe families who are really going to contribute to that place, who are going to stay there long term, because they've seen what happens when you only need a few retirees to move to a village before there's not enough housing stock for families to live there, and then the school will be closed. And then once the school closes, you lose a public space where people can come together, and then it starts to be more of a feeder town to one of the larger towns such as Fort William, and it loses a sense of community. So there's a real interesting community management techniques to try to retain these smaller villages as in some way to make sure that there is a livability there and a prosperity to these places.
Taking a kind of resume of these important dynamics you outlined in 3 different places, with a different culture, of course. Also, there is no direct 100% comparison possible. But if we try to make a kind of comparison, taking these 3 different places, despite their different cultures, together, which would be the major obstacles as regards the future development of these places in terms of identity and, in the end, in terms of viability, also economic viability?
I think perhaps building on where that last kind of point I made, one of the themes that cuts across is this idea of being able to, for the generation coming through, an ability to remain in the area that they wish to live, perhaps where they've grown up, to be able to afford that and to be able to return to those places and contribute to them. And this connects to housing and housing availability and affordability, but also viable, secure employment as well, and just an ability to have a strong sense of place and community. In terms of achieving that, I think there's a lot of things that could be done, but it does require a shift away from prioritizing growth and economic investment to these places, and actually considering different ways of facilitating housing market, and perhaps also not relying too heavily on tourism, given the challenges that it brings in terms of employment, in terms of permanency throughout the year, and the income that comes from the work often not being compatible with the cost of living in a tourism location. It's quite out of kilter. So having a diversified economy where tourism only forms one part of that is also really crucial. And I think in a sense, the touristification process is arguably more extensive and more intense in Tenerife, and that you can see that that's actually creating significant homelessness there and incompatibility of people to have a livelihood through the tourism industry in that place, in terms of being able to afford housing and having a secure employment. But that's something that really cuts across, I think, all 3 of the geographies that we're looking at, and I think being a bit more creative and open-minded to how housing and employment are managed. And I think employment's probably more open. I think there's more steps towards that, but probably housing is the real challenge, given the kind of speculative housing environment that affects those three locations as well as many other places.
Mhm. Okay. As regards when we take these three places in a common look, in a common vista again, despite their important differences, are there any economic viable alternatives on the medium and long run, except tourism means not depending solely on tourism, or more or less solely, as regards the economic prosperity of the place?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And with the three locations, the reason we're looking at these three areas is because they're perceived to be on the periphery, as I mentioned, of Europe at the start, and also there's a narrative that they depend on tourism, which is why we took them as the focus. So it's really tricky to rethink that. I think in the Highlands that Lochaber is located within, there is a real there's a real kind of parallel narrative around the potential for hydro and renewable energies at the moment, and that is attracting a lot of investment with its own kind of outcomes and processes, but that is creating a lot of viable employment and income to the regions, and a real sense of how do we make sure that there's a legacy from this infrastructural investment that's being made here, and these large-scale infrastructure projects don't just come, take the resources, and then go. So that's definitely kind of complementary to tourism and diversifying the place. In Tenerife, this is a real significant, long, ongoing conversation, because the Canary Islands are really far away, and they used to be quite a big agricultural exporter, but with the way that kind of global food circuits work now, the economics of it haven't really kind of worked out. So how they would diversify is a significant challenge for them, and they do really rely heavily on tourism. So I think it is more about how the model of tourism that's used and the types of tourism that they focus on, and at the moment the prioritization on quantity kind of prevails. In Gotland, it's, again, geopolitically, it's a really, really interesting place, because there's actually a lot of overlapping things going on simultaneous to tourism. There's large cement mining on the island, which again has its own implications, and there's an increasing military presence on the island as well, because of its geography and proximity to Russia, which brings its own employment to the island with its own kind of outcomes. Another interesting thing that they've done in Sweden is that they deliberately have decentralized their government agencies, so they're not all located on the mainland or in Stockholm. So there's don't test me on exactly which government agencies have been moved to Visby. It is actually, I think, culture and architecture areas, I forget the exact name, but there are kind of key civil servants at the national level who are based on Gotland, which is interesting. And they also have a finance sector, which is quite viable as well. So it is definitely more of a diversified economy, and it seems to be more about how to sync up tourism with these other aspects that are taking place, and thinking about tourism more as, rather than a discrete industry as it has been maybe traditionally, and integrating it more with its broader regional development strategies. And of course, Scotland also is very agricultural as well, although this has been kind of reducing over the kind of last few decades.
So do you think the trends in these small, let's say smaller marketplaces, Tenerife, Gotland, Scotland, you think this is sort of like an indicator of the overall trends across Western Europe, let's say right now?
Yeah, I think I think in the sense they're all being influenced by neoliberal processes that sit outside of those places, and they show themselves, they're variegated, and shows itself differently in the different geographies, but they're all part of broader tourism mobilities and development investment, real estate investment in these places that actually, yes, as you say, are part of broader kind of trends influencing Europe.
Yeah. And if the neoliberal system was to fail, what would be the replacement?
Yes, that's a heavy question. Yeah.
It's a very good question. It's a real alternative scenario. What if this whole neoliberal system will be gone away? What then with this?
Yeah, I mean, is it going to cause more problems for these small places like Gotland and other places, or is it just going to bring in a new system that will recreate the same problems again? I guess that's a question we really don't know at this point, right?
Yeah, but a really important question. It's interesting. So I live in Dumfries and Galloway in the south of Scotland, which is a really heavy agricultural area, very traditional, very conservative, that has been very anti-tourism from the resident perspective. For example, they tried to bring in a national park, and it was voted against because it was seen that it would bring too many tourists to the area. And there's a narrative here of degrowth or a lack of growth, and you see what that looks like in terms of some of the challenges around depopulation remain because there's no employment here, so a lot of young people do leave, and there is in some ways a lack of an ability to do things and have a sense of prosperity that comes with capitalism in a strange way, when things kind of are developed and they look good, there is a sense of energy that does come from that. So it's interesting to compare that to a place like Le Havre, which has changed so significantly through these processes and through the attraction of this kind of economic investment over the last 10 to 15 years. And there is an energy. So, yeah, I don't know really. Like, it's just to say that, yeah, I think there are definitely negatives that would come around, but I think also from my perspective personally, I think it is a reality in the sense that with changing climates and depleting resources, things will have to slow down quite significantly at a certain point, and there'll be less movement of people, so there will be less tourism because there aren't the resources, and it would just be very costly to move. It will be maybe more of an elite project, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but communities will look very different and change a lot less slowly. I don't know. That's a really bad answer. It's something I need that I haven't thought through so much.
Okay. Nonetheless, it's a scenario, and I think it is an important one. The question addressed by Grant is a really important one because it is our future in the end. We cannot sustain this neoliberal model of principally unlimited growth forever. This is not possible. Are there any concluding remarks from your side?
Only I think that I think also something that I've alluded to but not maybe addressed directly is the relationship between growth and neoliberalism and the movement to post-democratic structures and the lack of genuine mechanisms for representative democracy, which is something that we hope to think through more as kind of the next stage in the Just to a project, but I think is really crucial to coming to think through these sorts of ideas around what we actually want our places to look like and how that's determine what does it mean to be a place and what does it mean to be a community if we are trying to transition away from these growth models and such a high dependence on tourism, which I think is kind of interesting and important as part of kind of your question, Grant.
Yeah, I think it would be good if we do another podcast in the near future and we tackle some of these other problems and questions, because then we all have a little bit of time to think about them, right?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
And it's an important issue. This under the umbrella of the post-democratic development and society, it's a very important issue. We can address this as mentioned in an additional podcast, and in any case, we can mention it in our event to come in September on the loss of cultural heritage. Okay, I would finish now the official recording. And
and I just want to thank you for your time and thank you for all your thoughts. Very interesting.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I've really valued the conversation, and it's just great to be in contact. And I look forward to being more engaged and having more conversations.